At the age of 86, Mike Ditka is still remembered as one of the greatest icons in American football. He is one of the rare figures in NFL history to achieve legendary success in both roles, as a Hall of Fame player and the championship-winning head coach. As a player, Ditka revolutionized the tight end position, becoming one of the first to turn it into a true offensive weapon. He was selected to the Pro Bowl 5 times, earned All-Pro honors 3 times, and played a key role in the Chicago Bears' victory in the 1963 NFL Championship game. After retiring, he continued to add to his legacy as an assistant coach with the Dallas Cowboys, contributing to their win in Super Bowl 12. But the most glorious chapter of his career came when he returned to Chicago as head coach. Under Ditka's leadership, the 1985 Bears became one of the greatest teams in NFL history, dominating the league and winning convincingly in Super Bowl 20. Those achievements earned him a place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, where his name stands alongside the sport's biggest legends. To Chicago fans, Ditka wasn't just a coach. He was a symbol of toughness, of a fighting spirit that never backed down. A man who turned football into a source of pride for the entire city. But behind the trophies, the titles, and the victory parades was a life full of pain that very few truly understand. Football gave Ditka fame, but it also left countless scars on his body. The years of playing in a brutal era of the NFL subjected him to ferocious hits, head injuries, broken bones, and chronic pain that lasted for decades. In 1988, he suffered a heart attack that shocked the entire country. Many years later, age and old injuries continued to wear down his health, serving as a reminder that no warrior can fight forever. But physical pain wasn't the hardest part. Ditka also faced deep personal losses, especially when his great friend and protege Walter Payton passed away far too soon. To Ditka, that wasn't just the loss of a football legend, it was the loss of a brother. Yet it was precisely those pains that forged his unbreakable will. Ditka was never one to surrender to adversity. He lived by the philosophy that defined his entire life. If you get knocked down, get back up and keep fighting. And perhaps that spirit is the greatest legacy Mike Ditka left to American football. If the story of willpower and the scars behind the legend of Mike Ditka moves you, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep stories about sports icons. To understand why Mike Ditka became one of the toughest men American football has ever seen, we have to go back in time to a place far from the bright lights of NFL stadiums. Not Chicago, not the roaring grandstands, but a small town shaded in the gray of coal smoke and metal, Carnegie, Pennsylvania. In the 1940s and 1950s, Carnegie wasn't a place of big dreams. It was a steel mill town where life was measured by long factory shifts, by sweat, coal dust, and the constant clanging of metal day and night. Narrow streets covered in coal dust, small houses crowded together, and working families struggling to get by day after day. Ditka's father, Mike Ditka Sr., was a steel mill worker. Every day he left home before dawn and returned with an exhausted body and calloused hands after hours in front of hell-hot furnaces. That was the life of most men in that town. They didn't talk much about feelings. They had no time for weakness. The job taught them a simple rule: if you're not tough enough, you won't survive. The young Mike grew up among men like that: fathers, uncles, neighbors with stern faces and rough hands. They didn't teach him with words. They taught by living. And the first lesson he learned was that the world isn't gentle. Ditka's childhood wasn't like the sweet stories people often tell about growing up. There wasn't much time for carefree play. There weren't long, peaceful afternoons. Carnegie was a harsh place. Street fights among kids weren't rare. Rough words and fists appeared faster than sympathy. There, if you showed weakness, you'd get swallowed up. And Mike Ditka understood that very early. The boy didn't grow up with gentleness. He grew up with a simple but brutal lesson: To survive, you have to be strong. Those days shaped a part of the personality that the whole country would later come to know. Stubbornness, guts, a readiness to charge into any fight without backing down. But at that time, Ditka was just a boy trying to find a way out of that smoky, dusty town. And then he found it. On a rough grass field at school, football wasn't the only sport in Carnegie, but for Ditka, it quickly became something much bigger. When he first held the ball, something changed. On the field, strength wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was an advantage. On the field, aggression wasn't a problem. It was a weapon. And on the field, a boy from a steel town could become a warrior. Coaches quickly noticed that Mike Ditka wasn't like the other kids. He wasn't afraid of contact. He didn't back down. When he got knocked down, he got right back up and charged back into the play. There were practices where he went home covered in bruises. But for Ditka, pain wasn't a reason to stop. Pain was just part of the game. In fact, it was part of life. In the many years that followed, when fans saw Ditka screaming on the Chicago Bears sideline, they saw a fiery, intense coach. But those who understand Carnegie know that man was formed long before he ever stepped into the NFL. It started on those cold-dusted streets. From his father's exhausting work shifts, from the street fights among neighborhood kids, and from a boy who understood that if he wanted to escape this place, he had to become tougher than everyone around him. Football wasn't just a game to Mike Ditka. It was a door. It was an opportunity. And perhaps, deep in that boy's heart, back then, it was also a promise that his life wouldn't be trapped forever on the steel dust-covered streets of Carnegie. But the price of that road, the young Mike Ditka at the time couldn't yet imagine. But if the steel town of Carnegie forged Mike Ditka's toughness, then school was where that toughness was tested every day. The hallways of Carnegie schools weren't places of gentleness. There, boys growing up in working families learned to survive the only way their environment taught them, through strength. School wasn't easy for Ditka. He wasn't the top student in class. He wasn't the quiet, well-behaved boy sitting in the back. Instead, he became known in a completely different way. Mike Ditka was the hot-tempered kid, a kid quick to anger, a kid ready to fight if he felt insulted. Years later, old classmates still remembered him as a boy who never backed down. If someone challenged him, Ditka responded. If someone tried to bully him, Ditka fought back. Not because he loved violence, but because he understood very early that in the world he grew up in, weakness wasn't forgiven. There were days when teachers had to pull him out of schoolyard fights. There were times he was scolded, punished, reminded to control his temper. But what many didn't understand back then was that behind that hot temper wasn't senseless aggression. It was the survival instinct of a boy growing up in an unforgiving environment. And then football once again became the only place where that raw energy could be released. On the school's football field, Mike Ditka began drawing the attention of coaches. Not because he was the fastest, not because he had the most perfect technique, but because he had something very few young players possessed. He wasn't afraid of pain. In every practice, when other players hesitated before big hits, Ditka charged into them like it was the most natural thing in the world. When he hit the ground, he didn't stay down long. He popped right back up, brushed the dirt off his jersey, and ran back into formation. There were days he left the field with bruises on his shoulders, his back, his arms. But the next day, he was back. One high school coach once said about Ditka, "That kid has something different. He's not just tough, he doesn't know fear." To the coaches, that was a priceless quality. Football is a game of collisions, and a player who doesn't fear contact is always a huge asset. But for Ditka's body, that quality was a double-edged sword, because every hit he didn't avoid left a mark. Every time he got up after a painful tackle was another time his body paid a price. When he was young, he didn't think much about it. 16-year-old boys rarely think about old age. They think about winning. They think about proving themselves. And for Mike Ditka, proving himself was almost an obsession. He wanted to show everyone that the boy from the steel town wasn't weak. He wanted to show his father that all those years of hard labor weren't meaningless. And perhaps deep down, he also wanted to prove to himself that he could escape the life that was already set for so many boys in Carnegie. Those high school years passed with countless games, long practices, and increasingly brutal collisions. Mike Ditka gradually became one of the standout players on the team. College coaches started taking notice. Scholarship offers began to come in. For many, it was just the next step in a young athlete's career. But for Ditka, it meant much more. It was the road out of the steel town, out of factory shifts, out of the life his father and so many men in town had lived. Yet, there was one thing the young Mike Ditka at the time couldn't fully understand. The very quality that made him stand out, his grit, his lack of fear of pain, was also the thing that would follow him his whole life. It would help him become an NFL legend, but it would also leave wounds that, decades later, when the stadium lights had gone out, his body would still carry. And the journey that took the hot-tempered boy from Carnegie to America's biggest stadiums was only just beginning. And then the door that the boy from Carnegie had always dreamed of finally opened. In 1961, after impressive seasons in college, Mike Ditka officially stepped into the world he had imagined throughout his youth, the NFL. In that year's draft, he was selected by the iconic team of the city of Chicago, the Chicago Bears. For many young players, the moment their name is called on draft day is the brightest moment of their life. But for Ditka, it wasn't a moment of celebration. It was like stepping through the door onto a battlefield. Because the NFL of the 1960s wasn't like the modern league fans see today. When Ditka entered the league, professional football was still a raw, brutal sport with almost no protection for players. There were no strict concussion protocols, no rigorous medical procedures after hits, no state-of-the-art protective gear. When you stepped onto the field, every player understood they were risking their own body, and Mike Ditka stepped into that world with a familiar attitude. He wasn't afraid at all. Right in his rookie season, Ditka made waves. He didn't play like a rookie trying to survive. He played like a warrior who had been in the league his whole life. At the tight end position, which back then was mostly seen as a supporting role in the offense, Ditka completely changed how people viewed the position. He caught passes with power, he barreled through defensive lines like a truck, and when he needed to block, he hit with an aggression that surprised many defenders. In his very first season, Ditka set the rookie record for receiving yards by a tight end. Chicago fans started paying attention. Opposing coaches started worrying. But for Ditka, that was just the beginning of the war. Because every game in the NFL back then felt like a real battle. Tackles weren't just hard. They could be savage. Helmets crashed together like metal. Bodies slammed onto concrete hard turf. And many hits that would be heavily penalized today were considered just part of the game back then. Ditka didn't avoid it. In fact, he seemed to accept it as a natural law. In many games, he returned to the locker room with his body covered in bruises, shoulders aching, back stiff. There were collisions that left him dazed for a few seconds, but Ditka rarely left the field. In his era, players didn't talk much about injuries. They simply kept playing, and Mike Ditka played as if every game was a declaration that the boy from the steel town of Carnegie was ready for any battle. Chicago fans began to love him for that. He wasn't the flashiest player, but he played with an intensity that made the crowd feel like he was fighting for the entire city. Chicago is a city of working people, people who work in factories, on construction sites, in long, exhausting shifts. And when they saw Mike Ditka charging into giant opposing defenders, they saw themselves in him. But every warrior pays a price for their war. The hits Ditka never avoided began to leave consequences. At first it was just small pains, mornings waking up with a stiff body, joints aching after games. But over time, those accumulated collisions turned into deeper wounds. Football gave Ditka fame. It gave him the respect of teammates and fans, but it also began quietly taking pieces of his body. When he was young, Ditka rarely thought about it. In the mind of a 20-something player, the future is a very distant concept. The only thing that mattered was the next game, the next hit, the next win. But those hits, his body would never forget them. Decades later, when the stadium lights had gone out and the cheers had faded, the wounds from the battles of the 1960s were still there, silent, persistent, reminding him that Mike Ditka's war in the NFL had started very early, and its price would follow him for the rest of his life. As the first brutal seasons passed, Mike Ditka was no longer just a curious rookie on the Chicago Bears roster. He had become one of the most feared tight ends in the entire NFL. Defenders started knowing the name Ditka. Opposing coaches started preparing special schemes to deal with him. But even when they prepared, it didn't make the job any easier, because Mike Ditka didn't play like an ordinary player. He played like a man at war. A tight end in the 1960s, a player had to do everything: block, catch passes, collide head-on with massive defenders. And Ditka did all of it with an intensity that left many in awe. When he charged into the defensive line, he didn't avoid contact. He sought it. When a defender lined up to tackle, Ditka didn't try to dodge like many other players. He lowered his shoulder and drove straight into the opponent. The collisions rang out like metal clashing. The crowds in Chicago's stands roared. They loved that ferocious brand of football, and they loved Mike Ditka because he embodied that spirit. But success in the NFL rarely comes without a price. Mike Ditka's price started showing up very early. In those brutal games, his body constantly endured terrifying hits. Head-on helmet collisions left him dazed multiple times. Blindside tackles slammed him hard to the ground. There were games where he left the field with his head spinning, but minutes later, he was back out there as if nothing had happened. In his era, the concept of concussion was barely discussed. If a player could stand up and run, he kept playing. And Ditka always stood up. Beyond the head hits, his body endured other injuries: broken fingers, cracked ribs, collisions that left his shoulders aching for weeks. But Mike Ditka rarely complained. In the NFL back then, pain was normal. Players didn't talk about it on camera. They didn't share it with the press. They simply kept competing. And Ditka did it better than most. There were mornings after games when he woke up barely able to move. Back locked up, shoulders stabbing with pain, bruises covering his body. But when practice time came, he still showed up on the field. Teammates saw that, and they understood that this man didn't just love football, he was willing to sacrifice for it. That spirit made Ditka a natural leader in the locker room. Young players looked at him and learned endurance. If Ditka could get up after a vicious tackle, they had to do the same. But every time he got up, his body paid another price. The hits didn't disappear when the game ended. They accumulated, little by little, like small cracks in a wall. At first no one noticed, but over time they became deep wounds that nothing could fully erase. During his peak playing years, Ditka rarely thought about the long-term consequences. He only thought about the next game, about helping the team win, about proving he deserved his place in the NFL. Chicago fans saw a powerful, almost unbeatable player, but what they didn't see were the quiet evenings when he sat in the locker room rubbing aching joints. What they didn't see were the lingering pains that lasted after every season, and what they couldn't know was that those wounds would follow him for the rest of his life. Football gave Mike Ditka fame. It gave him the respect of teammates, coaches, and the entire city of Chicago. But every game, every hit, every tackle was also quietly taking a piece of his body. Back then, Mike Ditka was still young. He was still strong, and the war on the field continued. But deep inside, the wounds had already begun to form, wounds that many years later, when the stadium lights had gone out and the cheers existed only in memory, he would still carry. As the grueling playing years gradually came to a close, many thought Mike Ditka could finally rest. His body had taken too many hits. The injuries from previous seasons still lingered. Head blows, cracked bones, aching shoulders, all of them reminded him that an NFL player's time doesn't last forever. But for Ditka, leaving the field didn't mean leaving football, because football wasn't just his job. It was part of who he was. Many players feel empty after retirement. No more crowd noise, no more pounding heart before every game, no more intense practices or the rush of victory after a brutal battle. For Ditka, that silence was almost unbearable. He had lived too long in the world of collisions, strategy, and the pressure to win. So instead of walking away from football, he returned to it in a different way. A new opportunity came when he joined the Dallas Cowboys coaching staff as an assistant. For many former players, an assistant coaching job is just a job, but for Mike Ditka, it was like stepping onto another battlefield. The only difference was that this time, he wasn't directly taking the hits. He stood on the sideline, observing, analyzing, and commanding. In Dallas, Ditka worked under one of the NFL's legendary coaches, Tom Landry. Landry was known for his disciplined style and meticulous strategy. For Ditka, it was the perfect environment to learn. But it was also a place that revealed a part of his personality many had already seen when he was a player. Mike Ditka wasn't the type to stand quietly in the background. He wasn't the guy who just followed orders. Even as an assistant, he carried the spirit of a leader. He wanted to influence the game. He wanted to shape how the team played. And most importantly, he wanted to win. During Cowboys practices, Ditka was often the loudest one. He yelled at players when they made mistakes. He pushed them to train harder. Some young players were initially shocked by his intensity, but gradually they understood that Ditka wasn't yelling out of pointless anger. He did it because he believed football was a war, and in war, there's no room for laziness. Those years with the Dallas Cowboys also brought Ditka new moments of glory. When the team won Super Bowl VI and later Super Bowl XII, Ditka was no longer the player on the field. But he still felt that familiar rush of victory. It was a feeling he never wanted to leave behind. However, deep inside, something else was growing. Mike Ditka didn't just want to be a good assistant coach. He wanted more. He wanted to control the game. He wanted to build a team according to his own philosophy. He wanted to stand at the highest spot on the sideline, where every final decision belonged to him. In strategy meetings, Ditka often had bold ideas. He believed in a tough, direct style of play that reflected who he was. Sometimes those ideas surprised his colleagues, but they also made one thing clear. Mike Ditka wasn't meant to stay in a supporting role forever. He was born to lead. The people who worked with him in Dallas started to see it. They saw a former player whose fighting instinct hadn't faded at all. It had just taken a different form. No longer direct collisions on the grass, but strategic decisions, booming commands from the sideline. But no matter the position, one thing never changed. Mike Ditka never knew how to slow down. He didn't know how to rest. Because for him, football wasn't something you could turn off when the season ended. It was always there, in his thoughts, in his heart, in every breath, and though he didn't know exactly when the opportunity would come, Mike Ditka understood that one day he would have his own team. A team he could lead the only way he knew how, with toughness, discipline, and an unquenchable hunger to win. The opportunity that Mike Ditka had always been waiting for finally arrived in 1982. After many years as an assistant with the Dallas Cowboys, he was given the position he always believed he was born to hold, head coach of the Chicago Bears. For Chicago fans, the name Mike Ditka was no stranger. He had once been a player for this team, had fought in the Bears' colors, had been a part of the team's history. But when he returned, the Chicago Bears were no longer the fearsome team of years past. The team was sinking in failure. Many consecutive seasons passed with disappointing results. The stands at Soldier Field were still packed with fans, but the belief of the supporters had begun to fade. Chicago is a city of working people. They accept failure in many things, but they do not accept weakness. And for many years, the Bears seem to have lost the warrior identity that once made the entire NFL afraid. When Mike Ditka stepped into the locker room for the first time as head coach, he didn't bring sweet promises. He brought a simple message. The Chicago Bears would become a fearsome team again, and the path to doing that would not be easy at all. Right from the very first practices, the players could feel the difference. Ditka was not the gentle type of coach. He had no patience for laziness. He did not accept excuses. During practices, his shouts echoed across the field. He demanded that players train with the intensity of a game every single day. Some in the team were initially not used to that approach. But gradually, they understood that Mike Ditka didn't just want them to play football. He wanted them to fight. Ditka brought three things that the Chicago team had been missing for many years: discipline, ruthlessness, and a warrior spirit. Discipline meant every player had to follow the system. No one stood above the team. Ruthlessness meant that once they stepped onto the field, the Bears were not allowed to be soft. They had to crush opponents both physically and mentally. And the warrior spirit meant that no matter how tough the game got, they were never allowed to back down. The early years under Ditka were not always smooth. The NFL is not a place where you can change everything overnight. But as each season passed, the Bears began to transform. The defense became more ferocious, the style of play became tougher, and most importantly, the team started to believe in itself. An important part of that change was the emergence of special players. Among them, the most prominent was the legendary running back Walter Payton. Payton was not just a talented player. He was the embodiment of endurance, a man who could run through the opposing defense time after time without ever showing fatigue. Between Ditka and Payton, there was a complex relationship. Ditka was hot-tempered and explosive. Payton was calm and quiet. But both shared one thing in common: they hated losing. Around them, a powerful roster began to take shape. The Bears' defense became a nightmare for other teams. Names like Mike Singletary, Richard Dent, and Dan Hampton formed a steel wall in front of Chicago's end zone. Opponents stepping onto the field to face the Bears didn't just prepare tactics, they had to prepare for a real physical war. Under Ditka's leadership, the team gradually reclaimed its identity. The Chicago Bears were no longer the failing team of previous years. They became a team that every opponent had to respect. And then the 1985 season arrived. That was the season when everything seemed to come together perfectly. Ditka's system was complete. The players reached peak form, and the whole team played with an almost unshakable confidence. The 1985 Chicago Bears didn't just win games, they dominated. The team finished the season with a 15-1 record, crushing opponents with overwhelming point differentials. Their defense was regarded as one of the greatest in NFL history. People called them the monsters of the Midway. But behind that winning machine, there was always a familiar figure on the sideline: Mike Ditka. The Bears' jacket, the tense face, and the shouts that rang out whenever the team needed extra motivation. Chicago didn't just see a coach in him. They saw a man who represented the spirit of the city, a city of hard-working people who aren't afraid of hardship, aren't afraid to fight. And as the Bears entered the final stretch of the 1985 season, all of Chicago began to feel what they had been waiting for many years. Their team wasn't just back, they were closing in on history. But what few realized at the time was that glory always comes with enormous pressure, and the road to the peak for the Chicago Bears still had the biggest battle ahead. The 1985 season started like many other NFL seasons. Teams prepared strategies, coaches hoped, and fans looked forward to a dramatic season. But just a few weeks in, the entire league began to realize that something very different was happening with the Chicago Bears. Mike Ditka's team wasn't just winning games, they were dominating. Each week, the Bears stepped onto the field like a storm. Their defense charged at opponents with a power that made the whole NFL afraid. Opposing quarterbacks were constantly under pressure. Running plays were stopped dead. Tackles rang out like thunder on the grass. People started talking about the Chicago defense as one of the most fearsome that had ever existed. But amid that winning machine, there was one star that the entire country knew: Walter Payton. Payton wasn't just the team's best player. He was the heart of the Chicago Bears. His runs had a strange beauty, both powerful and relentless. Time after time, Payton barreled through the opposing defense, got up after brutal hits, and kept running. Fans called him by the respectful name, Sweetness. For Mike Ditka, Payton wasn't just a player. He was the one who could turn every tactical plan into reality on the field. As the season continued, wins followed wins. The Bears finished the regular season with a 15-1 record, a number almost unbelievable in a brutal league like the NFL. But what made this team special wasn't just the numbers, it was the way they won. They didn't just beat opponents, they overwhelmed them. The playoffs made that even clearer. Chicago entered the postseason with icy confidence. They crushed opponents with ferocious defense and efficient offense. When the Bears reached the championship game, the whole country knew this wasn't an ordinary team. And then the biggest game arrived, Super Bowl 20. Their opponent was the New England Patriots, but from the very first minutes, everyone realized the game was practically decided. The Chicago Bears played with the strength and confidence of a team that knew they couldn't be beaten. Their defense kept applying relentless pressure. Tackles left the Patriots barely able to mount an offense, and when the game ended with a crushing 46-10 score, the Chicago Bears officially became the champions of the world of football. The stands erupted. Chicago fans celebrated across the city. Trophies were raised high. And at the center of it all was Mike Ditka, the man on the sideline in the Bears jacket with fire in his eyes. In that moment, Ditka wasn't just a coach. He became a legend, a man who brought Chicago back to the top after years of disappointment. A man who built a team the entire NFL had to respect. But like many great stories in sports, glory often hides cracks beneath. Because behind the brilliant wins of the 1985 season, the team's internal dynamics were not always peaceful. In the locker room, there were big egos, there were power struggles, and especially the tension between Mike Ditka and the legendary defensive coordinator Buddy Ryan. Ryan believed his defense was the main reason the Bears dominated the league. Ditka, as head coach, believed the entire team was the result of the system and discipline he built. Two strong men, two big personalities, and sometimes their arguments were as heated as any battle on the field. Fans on the outside didn't see those things. They only saw the wins. They only saw the Super Bowl trophy. But inside the team, those conflicts had quietly begun to form, and Mike Ditka, the man who had just reached the peak of glory, still didn't know that his greatest challenges in football were still ahead. After the glorious victory at Super Bowl 20, the entire country looked at the Chicago Bears as an almost unbeatable football empire. The players became heroes. The city of Chicago lived in pride, and at the center of it all was Mike Ditka, the man hailed as the savior of the team. But behind the lights of victory and the celebratory parades, inside the Bears' locker room, another war existed. A war that didn't take place on the field, but between two strong men with two gigantic egos. That man was the team's legendary defensive coordinator, Buddy Ryan. Ryan was the architect of the famous 46 defense system that terrified teams across the NFL during the 1985 season. For Ryan, the Bears' defense wasn't just good, it was the true heart of the team. And he believed that his defensive system was the real reason Chicago became a great team. Meanwhile, Mike Ditka saw things differently. For him, a championship team couldn't exist without the discipline, leadership, and vision of the head coach. Ditka believed he had built the foundation for this team's success. Two men, two strong beliefs, two personalities, neither willing to back down. Throughout the 1985 season, the tensions between them flared up many times. There were strategy meetings that turned heated when Ditka and Ryan argued over how to use players. There were practices where their shouts echoed across the field. Teammates and assistant coaches sometimes had to step in to calm things down. But paradoxically, that very tension helped create the strength of the Chicago Bears. Ryan pushed the defense to play with unprecedented ferocity. Ditka drove the entire team with iron discipline and an insatiable hunger to win. The result was a team that was nearly unstoppable. However, victory doesn't always heal the cracks. One of the iconic moments of this conflict happened right in the Super Bowl itself, when Chicago was already leading by a huge margin. Buddy Ryan still wanted the defense to keep attacking aggressively. He wanted to prove that his system could completely crush the opponent, but Ditka viewed the game as a head coach. He wanted to control the tempo, protect the players, and finish the game securely. That difference reflected two completely opposing philosophies about football. Ryan believed in overwhelming power. Ditka believed in control and leadership. Outside the field, the media began to notice the tension between these two men. Reporters asked about their relationship in press conferences. Ditka usually answered briefly. Ryan was more straightforward. He didn't hesitate to say that his defense was the most important factor in the Bears' success. In the locker room, the players also felt the divide. Some sided with Ryan, believing his defensive system was what made the team special. Others stayed loyal to Ditka, the man who had led them to the championship. The irony was that despite such internal cracks, the Chicago Bears kept winning. On the field, they remained a fearsome machine, but those who understood football knew that the cracks inside a team are sometimes more dangerous than any opponent outside. And for Mike Ditka, the conflict with Buddy Ryan wasn't just a tactical argument. It was a reminder that even at the peak of glory, power in football always comes with struggles. In the end, that war couldn't last forever. After the glorious season, Buddy Ryan left Chicago to become head coach of another team. But the tensions of those years left a deep mark. For Ditka, the Super Bowl championship put him in history, but it also showed him an unavoidable truth. In football, victory doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes, even the greatest teams have to fight their own internal cracks. And for Mike Ditka, bigger challenges were still waiting ahead. In the years after the glorious era of the Chicago Bears, Mike Ditka's life gradually moved away from the victory lights of Super Bowl 20. He remained a legend in the eyes of fans, but like every other athlete and coach, time eventually pulled him away from the sideline. The 1990s passed with many changes. Ditka left Chicago, went through other chapters in his coaching career, and gradually stepped into a new phase of life where memories became bigger than games. But then, in 1999, news arrived that nearly broke his heart. His greatest pupil, the man the entire city of Chicago loved, was gone. Walter Payton passed away after battling a rare bile duct cancer. He was only 45 years old. The news spread across America like a wave of sorrow. Millions of NFL fans were stunned. But for Mike Ditka, that pain wasn't just losing a legendary player. It was losing a part of his family. Payton wasn't just the star of the 1985 team. He was the soul of the Chicago Bears, the man who always ran a few extra steps, always got up after every tackle, always carried the spirit that Ditka wanted to build in the team. Throughout the years they worked together, Ditka and Payton had built a relationship far deeper than coach and player. They understood each other, they respected each other, and they shared an unquenchable hunger to win. But what made Ditka cherish Payton wasn't just his talent on the field. It was the man off the field. It was the man off the field. Payton was always humble, always smiling, always caring about others. In the locker room, he was the one who could ease tension with just a humorous comment. In the community, he was the one who spent time with kids, with hospitals, with those in need. That's why, when Payton's illness was announced, Ditka was heartbroken. He followed every update on his former player's health. And when the news came that he passed away in November 1999, Ditka could barely accept the truth. In a later interview, he said a line that Chicago fans will never forget. Losing Walter was like losing family. Those words weren't just for the press. They were the real pain of a man who had gone through the fiercest battles of football with Payton. At Payton's funeral, Ditka stood quietly among the crowd. The man famous for his hot temper, for his shouts on the sideline, was almost speechless at that moment. Those who witnessed it said they had never seen Mike Ditka like that, no longer the general on the field, just a friend grieving. Payton's passing also reminded Ditka of a truth many in football try not to think about. NFL heroes are just human too. They fight, they endure, they sacrifice their bodies for the game. But life after football can sometimes be crueler than any game. For Ditka, this pain never fully went away. Whenever people talk about the 1985 season, they always mention the wins, the trophy, the great team. But in Ditka's heart, the strongest memory is always the image of Walter Payton running on the field with that familiar smile. And when that friend left too soon, a part of that great era went with him. For Mike Ditka, 1999 wasn't just the year he lost a football legend. It was the year he lost someone he considered a son, a brother, family. And from that moment, the life of the sideline general carried an additional scar that would never heal. After the emotional shock from Walter Payton's passing in 1999, Mike Ditka's life seemed to carry an even deeper crack in his soul. But in reality, even before that pain, his body had begun sending warning signals many years earlier. The signs showed that the price of a life spent fighting for football finally had to be paid. From his days as a Chicago Bears player in the 1960s, Ditka played like a soldier on the battlefield. He never shied away from contact. He wasn't afraid of pain. He tackled, dove in, and endured hits that the NFL probably wouldn't allow today. Back then, football was a brutal war. There weren't many rules to protect players. There wasn't deep understanding about head injuries or long-term body damage. Players simply stepped onto the field and fought. And Mike Ditka was one of the fiercest fighters. But the human body can't endure forever. In 1988, while Ditka was head coach of the Chicago Bears, the first major incident happened. He suffered a serious heart attack. The news stunned the entire NFL. The man everyone still saw shouting on the sideline with seemingly endless energy suddenly became a hospital patient. For Ditka, it was the moment that forced him to face the truth that his body was no longer invincible. Doctors told him that the high-stress lifestyle, the tremendous pressure of coaching in the NFL, combined with years of enduring stress and pain, had begun causing serious damage to his cardiovascular system. But like many other warriors in sports, Ditka didn't know how to slow down. After recovering, he returned to work almost immediately. On the outside, he was still the familiar Mike Ditka, the tough man, who never showed weakness. But inside, his body had started to change. In the years that followed, health issues appeared more and more frequently. Joint pains became more regular, the result of decades of collisions on the field. Old injuries from his playing days occasionally came back, making him ache whenever the weather changed. The pressure of coaching work-long seasons, tense games, sleepless nights continued to wear down his health. But Ditka kept working. After leaving Chicago, he continued his coaching career with the New Orleans Saints in the 1990s. That showed one very clear thing about the man. Mike Ditka didn't know how to walk away from the fight. Football wasn't just a job. It was his identity. But with each passing year, his body reminded him that time was winning. Back pains, heart issues, days when the energy wasn't what it used to be. The man who once ran up and down the sideline with a general's fury now had to start slowing down. And then, in later years, health problems kept appearing. Ditka underwent multiple surgeries related to his heart and other bodily issues. There were times he had to be hospitalized. There were times he was forced to pause his media and coaching activities. Each time, fans worried for the man they saw as a symbol of strength in the NFL. The irony is that the very warrior spirit that made Ditka a legend was also what made his body pay the heaviest price. The years of battling on the field, the brutal collisions, the intense seasons, all of it accumulated in his body. And as he entered old age, those traces became more visible than ever. But even as his health declined, Mike Ditka never lost his spirit. He still appeared on television, still talked about football with unchanged passion, still laughed, still argued, still carried the straightforwardness that fans always loved. The Warrior's body may have begun to break down, but Mike Ditka's spirit, the man who once led the Chicago Bears to glory, never surrendered. And perhaps that's what makes his story so special, because even when time and illness start winning over the body, the heart of a warrior keeps on fighting. After many decades living in the noise of NFL stadiums, Mike Ditka's life finally entered a completely different phase. No more tense strategy meetings, no more shouts echoing on the sideline when the game got chaotic. No more packed stands of Chicago Bears fans or the bright lights of Sunday afternoons. When football ended, what remained was silence. And for a man who had lived almost his entire life in the war of sports, that silence was sometimes scarier than any opponent on the field. When Ditka left the NFL after his final years coaching the New Orleans Saints, he stepped into a life he had never really prepared for. For decades, his schedule was dictated by the season, by the next game, by the pressure to win. But now, mornings came without tactics to draw up. No player lists to evaluate. No games that had to be won. Just a man and his memories. For many former NFL players and coaches, this is the hardest phase of life. Football isn't just work. It's their identity. It's how they define themselves. And when that game disappears, a huge void appears. Ditka was no exception. In the early years after leaving the sideline, he admitted that sometimes he felt empty. Many mornings he woke up wondering what to do next. No more battles. No more clear goals. The man who once commanded great teams now had to learn how to live like an ordinary person. However, Ditka didn't completely leave football behind. He began appearing on television as a commentator. In sports shows, fans got to see his familiar image again, straightforward, strong, sometimes hot-tempered, but always full of passion for the game he loved. Those on-air debates helped him maintain some connection to the NFL. But even so, it couldn't fully replace the feeling of standing on the field, because nothing compares to the moment when the game starts, when tens of thousands of fans roar, when every decision you make can change the fate of a game. Outside the world of football, Ditka also tried to build a new life. He got involved in various business activities, especially the restaurant business in Chicago. One of the most famous spots is the chain of restaurants bearing his name, where fans can come eat and see memorabilia from his legendary career. For many fans, that's how they stay connected to a city icon. But for Ditka, it was also a way to hold on to a piece of the past. The photos, the jerseys, the mementos from the 1985 season, all of them, reminded him of a time when life was simpler. Fight, win, and move on to the next week. However, time never stops. As the years passed, old teammates, players who once fought alongside him, began to age one by one, and some passed away. Each time, Ditka felt like a part of the old world was disappearing. His generation, the generation of brutal football, of warriors unafraid of pain, was gradually becoming memory. In those quiet moments, Ditka often thought back to the years on the field. He remembered the sound of helmet collisions. He remembered the tension before a big game. He remembered the evenings when the team had just won, and the whole city of Chicago seemed to explode with joy. But he also remembered the hardships, the injuries, the pressures, the sleepless nights, and perhaps for the first time in his life, he had time to reflect on all of it. Life after football lacks the drama of the NFL. No big battles, but it brings something else. Time to look back, time to understand that behind the legend, behind the Bears jacket and the sideline shouts, Mike Ditka is just a human being, a man learning to live with his memories. And in that silence after football, he began to realize that the biggest fights in life sometimes happen when the stadium lights have gone out. After many years living in the silence of post-football life, Mike Ditka gradually stepped into a phase that every sports legend eventually has to face: old age. No more practices under freezing cold skies. No more battles deciding the fate of a season. No more moments when tens of thousands of Chicago Bears fans roared from the stands. Instead, there were quiet mornings where time moved much more slowly. And in that stillness, Ditka began to realize something unavoidable. His generation was slowly disappearing. The men who once fought alongside him on the field, the ones who stood in the locker room of the 1985 team, were leaving one by one. Some because of illness, some because of old age, some because of the long-term consequences of a brutal sport. Each time he heard news of another old friend from the NFL passing away, Ditka felt like a piece of the past was being taken away. Names that once echoed through football history now became memories. Men who once ran, tackled, and fought under stadium lights now existed only in old photos. For Ditka, it wasn't just sadness. It was a reminder that his era had truly passed. The NFL today is very different from when he played and coached. The game is faster, safer. Rules protecting players are much stricter. The brutal hits that were normal in the 1960s and 1980s can now draw heavy penalties. For many young people, Ditka's football belongs to another time, a time when players played with almost unchecked ferocity. Sometimes, when watching modern games on television, Ditka realizes that the game he once knew has changed. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. And in that moment he understands that every generation has its own era. His era has passed. But what makes Mike Ditka's story so special is that even as time moves on, the city of Chicago has never forgotten him. For many people there, Ditka isn't just a coach. He's a symbol of the time when the Chicago Bears stood at the pinnacle of the NFL. Whenever he appears at sports events or his restaurant, fans still come up to take photos, shake his hand, and tell him that the 1985 team gave them memories they will never forget. For Ditka, those moments carry deep meaning. They remind him that even though the era has changed, what he and his team achieved still lives in the hearts of the fans. But old age also brings different thoughts. Thoughts that a young coach rarely has time to consider. Ditka began looking back at his life not just through wins and losses, but through the people who entered and left his journey. He thought about the players who fought under him, thought about Walter Payton, the friend and pupil he lost too soon, thought about the old teammates who believed in him when the whole world doubted. In quiet evenings, as the city of Chicago settled under its lights, Ditka sometimes sat silently and reflected on those years. Not with regret, but with a deeper understanding of time. He knew that every career has an end. Every era has a closing day. But what matters isn't how long you stay at the top. It's what you leave behind when the stadium lights go out. And when looking back on his journey from a boy growing up in a poor industrial town in Pennsylvania to an NFL player to a Super Bowl-winning coach, Mike Ditka understood that his life had gone far beyond what that boy ever imagined. The world may have changed. Football may have entered a new era. But for Chicago, Mike Ditka will always be the general on the sideline. A legend quietly watching time pass by. When old age arrives, people often begin looking back on their own journey. And for Mike Ditka, that journey isn't just the story of a sports career. It's an entire life built from fighting, sacrifice, and memories that will never fade. The quiet mornings of his 80s brought him something he never had for decades. Time to reflect. No more training schedules. No more pressure to win the next game. No more strategy meetings stretching into the middle of the night. Just a man and a whole life behind him. When looking back, Ditka's achievements almost read like a legend in American football history. He was once one of the greatest tight ends for the Chicago Bears, a player who played with ferocity that made opponents afraid. Then he became the head coach who led the Chicago Bears to victory at Super Bowl 21, of the most iconic wins in NFL history. And then, in 1988, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as a player, an honor very few in football achieve. Those accomplishments could make anyone proud. They are proof of an extraordinary life. But for Ditka, when looking at it all, he understood that every victory came with a price. The first price was his health. His body carried the marks of decades fighting in a brutal sport. The collisions from his playing days still left consequences as he entered old age. The back pains, the heart issues, the hospital stays, all were reminders that a warrior's body can't last forever. Then there were the friends. Throughout his football life, Ditka fought alongside so many people. Players, coaches, teammates, those who stood beside him in the locker room, who shared victories and defeats. But time is an opponent no one can beat. Many of them have passed away, and each time Ditka felt a piece of the past vanish. One of his greatest losses was Walter Payton, the pupil he considered family, the man who helped create the legendary 1985 season. When Payton died too soon, Ditka didn't just lose a great player. He lost a friend, and that pain still lingers in his memory years later. But perhaps what Ditka realized most clearly when looking back on his life was the sacrifice of time. For decades, football took up almost his entire existence. Long seasons, constant travel, days and nights revolving around winning and losing. There were moments in life he barely stopped to enjoy. And when old age came, he began to understand that time is the most precious thing a person has. Wins can go into history. Trophies can be displayed in museums, but the years that passed never come back. Yet what makes Mike Ditka's story so special is that he doesn't look back on his life with regret. He sees it as a challenging journey. He lived to the fullest. From a poor boy growing up in the industrial town of Carnegie, Pennsylvania, he became an icon of American football. He fought, he won, he lost, he endured loss. But he never stopped moving forward. And when sitting quietly amid the memories of his life, Mike Ditka understood that his legacy isn't just in the trophies or the titles. It lies in the spirit he brought to every game. The spirit of a warrior who never backs down. A man willing to pay the price for what he believes in. And perhaps that's the true weight of memory. Not what you achieved, but the person you became throughout that journey. When looking back on Mike Ditka's entire journey, it's easy to get swept up in the victories, the trophies, and the glorious moments that made him one of the biggest icons in American football. But if you only look at those wins, his story becomes too simple. Because the truth is, Mike Ditka was never a perfect man. He was hot-tempered. He was tough. He was straightforward to the point that sometimes it made others uncomfortable. Throughout his career, he sparked controversy many times. On the sideline, he could yell right in a player's face. In press conferences, he could say things that many other coaches wouldn't dare say. To some people, he was a symbol of fighting spirit, but to others, he was a man who was too hard, too harsh, too difficult to work with. And perhaps that's exactly what made Mike Ditka the man he was, because he was born into a world without gentleness. He grew up in a poor industrial town in Pennsylvania, where men worked in steel mills and life taught you that to survive, you had to be tougher than the hardships around you. Football wasn't just a game to Ditka. It was his way out of the life he was born into. And when he stepped into the NFL as a Chicago Bears player, he brought the spirit of someone who never accepted defeat. On the field, he played like a warrior. The collisions didn't scare him. The injuries didn't make him back down. And that very spirit helped him become one of the greatest tight ends of his era. But Mike Ditka's story didn't end when he left the field as a player. In fact, the greatest chapter of his life began when he became a coach. When he returned to Chicago as head coach, the team was in a phase full of disappointment. Fans had waited years to see the Bears return to the top. And Mike Ditka brought what this city needed: discipline, intensity, and an unshakable belief that winning was mandatory. Under his leadership, the legendary 1985 team was born. A team that didn't just win games, it dominated the entire league. When they stepped into Super Bowl 20, the Chicago Bears had become a storm. No team could stop. And when the Lombardi Trophy was raised high, Mike Ditka etched his name into NFL history. But his life has proven many times, glory never lasts forever. The years that followed brought Ditka many challenges: pressure, internal conflicts, failures, and ultimately the loss of close friends like Walter Payton. Then came the health issues, the heart attack, the signs of a body that had been through too many battles. And when old age arrived, Mike Ditka had to face what every warrior eventually faces: time. Time takes away the strength of the body. Time takes away old friends. Time turns noisy stadiums into memories. But if there's one thing Mike Ditka's life proves, it's that a warrior's spirit doesn't fade easily. Even though he's no longer on the Chicago Bears sideline, he remains part of the team's soul. Chicago fans still remember his image: the Bears jacket, the sunglasses, and the booming shouts when the game got tense. For this city, Ditka isn't just a coach. He's a symbol of an era when Chicago football stood for toughness, for pride, for a spirit that never gives up. And when looking at his life, people realize that what made Mike Ditka great wasn't just the titles. It wasn't just the Super Bowl trophy. It wasn't just his induction into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. What made him a legend was the battles he survived. From a poor boy in a steel town, to an NFL player, to a championship coach, to an old man looking back on his life with all the scars of the past. Mike Ditka isn't perfect. He never tried to be perfect. But he is a warrior, and sometimes in sports, as in life, warriors like that are the ones history remembers the longest. Because in the end, legends are not remembered for the trophies they hold. They are remembered for the battles they survive. The story of Mike Ditka leaves a feeling of both pride and sorrow for anyone who fully understands his journey. Throughout the story, we clearly see the image of a man forged from hardship in the steel town of Carnegie, Pennsylvania, where a harsh life shaped a personality that almost never knew how to back down. That very toughness brought him to football, and later made him an icon of the Chicago Bears. But the price of that greatness is also very clear in the story. The injuries from his playing days, the heart attack in 1988, and the series of health issues afterward showed that the body of an NFL warrior cannot escape the ravages of time. The emotional pain was just as deep when he lost his pupil and close friend Walter Payton in 1999, an event Ditka himself admitted felt like losing a family member. Those details make the victory at Super Bowl 20 or the honor of being inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame not just milestones of glory, but proof of a life that paid a heavy price to achieve success. For Americans, this story carries a very familiar meaning in American sports culture. Greatness doesn't come from perfection, but from the ability to get back up after pain. Mike Ditka was hot-tempered, controversial, and sometimes too harsh. But he was also the embodiment of the work ethic and enduring will that America always honors. The biggest lesson from his life is probably this: success isn't measured only by wins or titles, but by how a person overcomes adversity, holds on to belief, and keeps moving forward even when the body and time are against him. If the story of Mike Ditka's resilience and life battles has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the inspiring journeys of sports legends together. Thank you for watching to the end, and see you in the next video where more untold stories of American icons will continue to be revealed.